Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into a pretty profound source text that asks a deeply uncomfortable but absolutely necessary question. How do care-based institutions systemically fail the vulnerable people who come to them for help? And more importantly, how can they build the actual architecture to fix it? Now, our source material explores this through the lens of religious institutions, specifically looking at the Catholic Church and canon law. But honestly, the lessons on institutional design and human suffering apply to almost any organization. We're going to unpack how cries for help so often just disappear into administrative silence, and exactly how we can stop that from happening.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with what is that to us, then explore the duty to receive, define a concept called ecclesial omission, look at when institutional systems fail, and finally wrap up with building reception accountability. Kicking things off with Section 1, what is that to us? And really, we're talking about the danger of dismissal here. Because to understand how systems fail, we first have to look at the haunting question of misclassification. To really get this point across, our source material brings up the famous actor Bela Lugosi. Lugosi was a super versatile actor for 20 years, but the studio system completely reduced him to a single profitable label, horror. He was boxed in by a powerful system that just flat out refused to see anything else. And this perfectly captures the danger of being reduced to a mere label by a massive bureaucracy. Lugosi actually said that without those versatile parts, he was reduced to freak status. And man, the psychological toll of that kind of misclassification is just devastating. When a suffering person approaches a large institution and gets misclassified or, reduced to just an administrative problem, their genuine complex plea for help often vanishes entirely. They basically cease to be a person and just become a category, or even worse, a nuisance. The author argues that this dynamic actually echoes the ultimate paradigm of a rejected plea, which is found in the Gospel of Matthew. After betraying Jesus, Judas goes back to the chief priests in profound moral and psychological distress. He confesses his guilt, but the institution's response is honestly chilling. They tell him, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." They don't deny his guilt. They simply completely decline any pastoral responsibility. They refuse to receive him. To ground this, the source text uses a fantastic everyday analogy. Imagine you're at the grocery store and you accidentally knock over a massive shelf of cookies. It's totally your fault and you feel awful about it. So you go to the manager, confess what you did, and ask for help cleaning it up. Now imagine the manager just shrugs, says, "Not my problem," and walks away. You're just left standing there in the cookie chaos. That is exactly what happens when an institution hears a cry for help but refuses to take ownership of the next step. So, if what is that to us is the completely wrong answer, what's the right one? Let's move into Section 2, the duty to receive and seeing the vulnerable. Drawing heavily on Catholic theology and canon law, the text points out that leaders have a massive, and I mean massive, duty of care. A true shepherd doesn't just manage the sheep that happen to wander into the office. A shepherd has to actively see, approach, and receive a vulnerable person before passing any kind of judgment. You literally cannot help someone you refuse to look at, and you definitely can't evaluate a plea you haven't taken the time to truly hear. But what happens when that beautiful pastoral theology crashes headfirst into the harsh, bureaucratic reality of flawed systems? Well, that brings us to Section 3, ecclesial omission, and what happens when systems fail. Here is the absolute core of the issue, this concept called ecclesial omission. This is what happens when a cry for help completely disappears into administrative silence. And I want to be clear here, this usually doesn't happen out of malice or cruelty. It happens because of a complete lack of structure. The person asks for help, the institution technically exists to provide it, but somewhere in the middle, the request just evaporates. I absolutely love the analogy the source uses here. It compares this dynamic to a relay race. Imagine a track team where every single runner firmly believes the next person grabbed the baton. They're all sprinting their hearts out, totally convinced the race is going great. But the baton is actually just sitting there, completely forgotten, on the starting line. Nobody meant to drop it, but nobody actually owned the responsibility of holding it. When institutions lack structure, vulnerable people become that forgotten baton. Which really forces us to ask, why do these gaps even exist in the first place? Let's get into Section 4, system failures, and why these gaps occur. It all comes down to how institutions handle different kinds of information. Institutions are usually amazing at handling formal administrative paperwork. If an official decree is ignored, but the text calls administrative silence, there are legal paper trails, strict deadlines, and review procedures. But when a person walks in crying or mentions a crisis in passing, that's pastoral silence. It's informal, it's totally undocumented. Without a clear system, that desperate plea can simply fade away without a trace, all because it never entered a formal accountability track. The author gives us another brilliant analogy here. Imagine a school where instead of having an actual structured fire alarm system, the principal tells the students to just vibe their way to safety during a fire. No way, right? It would be absolute chaos. Yet surprisingly, so many organizations handle profound human crises with this exact same lack of systemic structure. They rely entirely on good intentions instead of building reliable alarms. So the big takeaway here is that institutions have got to stop relying on what the text's called personal architecture. Banking on that one incredibly kind person in the office whose memory and energy holds everything together. People get tired, they retire, they get overwhelmed. Instead, organizations must build institutional architecture. We're talking about a reliable, reviewable system of care that catches people when individuals inevitably drop the ball. All right, we've diagnosed the illness. Now let's look at the cure. Section 5. Building accountability and creating a systemic guarantee. The ultimate solution proposed here is called reception accountability, and this is a total game changer. It shifts the burden of care away from just hoping people have personal goodwill and creates an actual systemic guarantee that a request is being tracked. It ensures that when someone asks for help, we can clearly point to who is responsible for handling it, and we can actually review whether any action was taken. Think of it kind of like losing a library book. When you report a lost book, you don't need a massive 100-page bureaucratic report on the history of reading, right? You literally just need one specific librarian to say, I own this problem until we find it. They write it down, they check the shelves, and they get back to you. That is reception accountability in a nutshell. It's not about endless paperwork. It's about ownership. To build that architecture, the source lays out these 8 concrete elements. You need accessibility, meaning people can actually reach you. Recognition, so you understand the real need. Assignment, which is absolutely crucial, means someone specifically owns the problem. Then there's documentation, so it's not forgotten. After that, you need an appropriate response, follow-up to make sure they didn't fall through the cracks, escalation for things above your pay grade, and finally, review, so the institution actually learns from its mistakes over time. Together, these create a true ecology of reception. Now, here is a really critical distinction. We spend so much time in organizations arguing over decision accountability, like, did the institution make the right choice? But honestly, you cannot begin to judge whether a decision was correct if nobody ever took responsibility for receiving the person's plea in the first place. Reception accountability absolutely has to come first. You can't make a good decision about a person you completely failed to notice. Because when you strip away all the academic theology, the canon law, the complex organizational theory we've explored today, everything just hinges on this one haunting, rhythmic question. Who actually received this suffering person? When the dust finally settles, can you point to the specific person whose job it was to ensure they weren't abandoned? I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. Think about the organizations you belong to, your workplace, your school, your community groups. Do they exist just to process paperwork and make administrative decisions? Or do they possess the actual built-in architecture to make absolutely sure no cry for help ever goes unheard? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gives you a fresh lens for looking at how we can build systems that truly, genuinely care for people.